Montego Bay. Instructions. In Montego Bay, the players must move their two dockers around the warehouses skillfully to acquire as many barrels as possible and perhaps a few silver coins. Preparing the game. Place the game board in the middle of the table. The number on the tavern roof shows which side of the board is suitable for which number of players. Then insert the guide rail into the groove on the board. Once they've agreed on the colors, each player gets 2 dockers and 16 barrels in his color. Each player also gets 5 movement cards per docker in the matching color, the darker ones for the large figures, the lighter ones for the small ones. These are used to move the docker around the warehouses. The playing order counters are shuffled and inserted into the guide rail. They determine the sequence in which the dockers are moved. The cards with the warehouses are shuffled and laid out on the board. You only need the warehouse with the 4 on the roof if there are 4 of you playing. Position the pilot board at Pier 1. The other ships are shuffled and 3 of them laid out at the remaining 3 piers. If there are 4 players, the side with the red numbers should be facing up. If there are 2 or 3 players, the yellow numbers should face up. Now form 2 stacks, each with 6 freighters from the remaining ship cards. Place the tallyman on the box next to the tavern, the counters at the start of the victory points scale, and the 15 silver coins next to the game board, along with Lazy Jack. To finish with, the small docker figures are placed on the tavern next to the guide rail and the large ones on the tavern opposite. If there are only 2 players, each of them gets an extra docker of a different color. This means that the game is played with 3 dockers per player, whereby the size and color of the additional docker have to be different. As the game progresses, the additional dockers are treated as if they had the color of each of the players. Playing the game. Montego Bay is played in rounds, each of which consist of 2 phases. In the first phase, the players move their dockers around the warehouses. In the second phase, the barrels from the warehouse are loaded onto the ships and tallied up. Moving the dockers. The sequence in which the dockers are moved is determined by the playing order counters in the guide rail. At the beginning of a round, every player picks 1 card face down for each of his 2 dockers. The number on the card shows the number of squares the docker is to be moved forward by in the direction of the arrow. If a docker lands on a square on which another docker is already standing, the first docker is shoved over to the other side of the warehouse. It's just bad luck, though, if another docker is already standing on the other side, because you then get moved back to the first free square in the opposite direction, whether you want to or not. Once all the cards have been turned face up, the players take them back into their hand, because all cards have to be available to them in every round. Tallyman, keeping tabs on the dockers. Once all of the dockers have found a space, the tallyman comes into the game. Starting from his place on the box and moving in the opposite direction, he checks how many barrels each docker is allowed to load onto the ships. 1 storage room is assigned precisely to each square here. The player whose docker is currently being checked by the tallyman takes the number of barrels shown in the warehouse from his pile and distributes them immediately over 1 or several ships of his choice. If a docker happens to be standing in front of a warehouse with broken barrels, the player must unload the corresponding number of his barrels from the ships and put them back on his pile, if he has already loaded any. If a silver coin is depicted in the warehouse, the player in question should take one from the pile. The tallyman uses this method to tally every docker. Ship valuation. Once a ship is fully loaded, it can leave port immediately and begin its long voyage. A fully loaded ship is valuated as follows. The player with the most barrels on board gets the highest number of victory points shown on the ship. The player with the second highest number of barrels gets the second highest number of points, etc. The one that fills the last stowage compartment even gets an extra victory point. In the event of a tie, the points of the corresponding spaces are added up and divided by the number of players involved. Uneven numbers should be rounded down. The valuated ship is removed from the game and the barrels are returned to the players' piles. The remaining ships move one pier up and a ship from the pack is placed on Pier 4. End of a round. A round finishes once the last docker has been checked by the tallyman. At the end, the front ship disembarks and is evaluated. In the first round, this is the pilot boat, which has no stowage compartments and cannot be evaluated. The order of play is changed now by placing the last counter on the 1 and moving all of the remaining ones upward with the motto, "The last will be the first." If the first ship stack has been used up, the playing order counters are taken out of the rail at the end of this round, shuffled, and used in a different sequence. From now on, the ship outlay is supplemented from the second stack. Lazy Jack. The question remains as to what function the silver coins have. If a player has 3 of them, he can hire Lazy Jack for a round. He is then used along with the player's 2 dockers and can earn him additional barrels. To motivate Lazy Jack to work, a player puts 3 silver coins back into the pile at the beginning of a round and places Lazy Jack on the same square as one of his dockers. If several players want to hire Lazy Jack, the player with the fewest victory points has first priority. If there's a tie here too, the player whose playing order counter is furthest forward gets Lazy Jack. He now picks an additional card from the card set of the corresponding docker and uses this card to determine how many squares Lazy Jack is to move forward. If he lands in front of a warehouse with broken barrels, no barrels have to be unloaded for him, but he can be given silver coins. He's tallied by the tallyman using the same system as the one used for the other dockers. End of game. The game ends when only 3 or fewer ships are still in port after the tallyman has tallied the last docker and the outlay can no longer be filled up. Any ships still in port are valuated. If a player still owns barrels at the end of the round which he cannot load because all of the ships have left, he can deliver them to the tavern for a few victory points. The number of victory points depends on the number of players. 3 points for the highest number of delivered barrels with 4 players, 2 for the second highest, and 1 for the third highest. 1 less victory point is awarded in each instance when there are only 3 players and 2 less when there are only 2 players. The player with the most victory points at the end of the game wins. In the event of a tie, the player with the most coins wins. If there's a tie here too, the players are declared joint winners. Queen Games, Connecting Generations.